Thank you very much. So as our chair has already highlighted, I think it's internationally recognized that the quality of teachers, the way in which teachers are prepared to develop more inclusive schools is really a key factor in developing a more inclusive school system. It's not the only thing, but it's clearly recognized as a very important feature of inclusive schooling systems. So we were delighted to be invited to work with the NCSE on this project. And I'd like to say, first of all, that Joe and I are representing a research team. So at Manchester is my colleague Yvette Solomon and Caterina Mazziari. Here at University College Cork, this is very much a collaboration with colleagues here, Professor Cathy Hall, Fiona Murku, who's now at Mary Immaculate College, Kevin Carhill and Katrina Curtin, who's here also. That was our team. We were supported throughout very much by the members of the advisory committee appointed by the NCSE, and also we had access to a team of expert advisors internationally as well, some of who are here. So we were delighted to be part of this project. It was, for me, an important project in terms of research on teacher education. So in 2012, as you may know, there was a reform of teacher education accreditation in Ireland. All programs had to incorporate mandatory content around inclusion, as well as other areas such as literacy and numeracy and so on. And so we had an opportunity to do a study of change, system-wide change, and a longitudinal study. So this is on a large scale. So that was a unique opportunity to see what happens when you try and change the whole system across a state, and you're given the opportunity to study, to follow that through over a period of years. And we think it was actually the first study of that scope and scale in Europe that we're aware of. So it was also at a time of significant changes within the landscape of teacher education and the organisation of teacher education providers and so on. So we were delighted to be invited to do this. And I'll just say a few words about the scale of the project itself, just to say that it ran over 3 years, that we started with finding out what was out there in the international research, looking at the literature, that we had the opportunity to look at the program documentation for teacher education programs across Ireland. So we actually analysed the documents submitted by teacher education providers to the Teaching Council, and we did a survey of teacher educators. In the first year, we were really concerned to understand the student-teacher experience primarily, and so we surveyed student teachers across all the institutions in Ireland. We interviewed quite a number, and we interviewed teacher educators as well. So that was the first year of the study, focusing on understanding really what is happening in teacher education, what are the students experiencing, and a lot of data. It's quite a large-scale project. And then we went on to, over the first period of the working with newly qualified teachers, we followed those student teachers into their first year and the second year of teaching. We repeated our surveys, we followed them up with interviews, we spoke to their school principals, and we did that again in their second year of teaching. So that was a fantastic opportunity to find out how things changed for them. So our report on the first year of the project was published last year. The report on the rest of the project is due to be published shortly. And that's just a few words really, just to clarify the scale of the project. We were asked by the NCSE to focus on understanding what is actually the content, what are the components of initial teacher education programs in relation to inclusive education, and how well prepared are student teachers to become more inclusive teachers when they qualify, and what sort of experiences are they having as newly qualified teachers, to try and identify perhaps any gaps there might be within initial teacher education for further development, and what lessons there might be for the continuum of teacher education from initial teacher education and induction. Those are the areas we were asked to focus on. And we took as our starting point the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education's profile of inclusive teachers. So this was a result of a 4-year project involving 25 European countries, and which produced, amongst other things, this profile of inclusive teachers. So it's kind of a large-size operational definition of what do you mean by inclusion in teacher education. And it was based on the notion of core values and looking at in relation to broad areas of competence and what were the attitudes and beliefs, what are the knowledges and understandings underpinning that, and what are the skills and abilities required to implement inclusive teaching in that sense. And it was very much focused on a broader approach to inclusive education that's not restricted to children identified with particular categories of special educational need or disability, but adopting a broader approach incorporating learners who might be marginalised or excluded for a variety of reasons from educational opportunities. So that was our tool, if you like. And the kind of core values that started from were about valuing learner diversity and supporting all learners as sort of core values for inclusive teaching, inclusive education, and other familiar areas of teacher education about working with others and continuing professional development. So I'm going to say something about what we found in the first year of the project, and then I'm going to hand over to Joe to talk about some of the data. Then I'm going to come back and talk about some of the findings of the later part of the project. So first of all, looking at the course documents, we found that really the predominant model was really discrete modules. So you could talk about special needs or inclusive education across the piece, permeated across a teacher education program, or you can talk about it in specific mini courses called modules or units of a course, which got titles that said, this is the SEN bit, if you like. And we found that was the predominant model. And actually, the predominant focus was actually on special educational needs rather than this broader approach to inclusion. There was broader coverage as well. There were some modules and parts of courses that covered that stuff. In general, the main emphasis was really on the values and attitudes for inclusion. There was enormous emphasis on aspects of social justice and the kind of values and attitudes that might underpin more inclusive teaching, more so than on the skills required to implement them. And so, for example, reflection was about social justice and criticality rather than reflecting on practice for problem solving for inclusive teaching in the classroom, for example. So this slide illustrates, hopefully, this kind of gap between the values and the skills. So this is an illustration based on an analysis of the content of teacher education program documents, not in one provider, but across the state. So in the left-hand side, you can see, hopefully, the title Conceptions of Inclusive Education. So that would be an area of competence in the core value or valuing differences would be how well do student teachers understand or conceive of inclusive education. And you can see that blue column is quite relatively high. So there's a relatively high amount of coverage around the attitudes and beliefs related to understanding conceptions of inclusive education. At the back there's a short grey one, which is related to skills and abilities. So it just kind of illustrates in a way there's a much higher proportion of emphasis on the attitudes and beliefs than on the skills and abilities required to implement that. That was for looking at the documentation, and we found that really across the piece when we spoke to the students and when we spoke to other people. The student teachers were generally very positive about their courses, and they were positive about inclusive education. They liked when the guidance was within a specific subject area, they found that very helpful. They also gained a lot from particular experiences in specialist provision. They attributed a great deal of learning to those kinds of experiences. Where there were one or two pathways that were specializing in special educational needs, interestingly, those students often talked about those experiences as benefiting them to be teachers of all children because of the greater emphasis on practical aspects of teaching as opposed to curriculum knowledge. They weren't necessarily going to be special school teachers always. But there was this sense of disconnection in the students' accounts between the school and college-based elements of their initial teacher education. This is, and in one sense, this is an international phenomenon, but in this, it certainly did apply to their experiences in relation to inclusive education. Sometimes they were a little bit negative in some cases about what they saw as a missing practical skills input. They did seem to emphasize the experience in schools as particularly helpful. But this was not focused on any particular provider or program. Actually, we noticed that there were variations in students' accounts within a particular provider. And this kind of reflected the experiences they had in schools, variations between the roles of different cooperating teachers, and the ways in which different colleagues were, how well placed they were to support inclusive teaching with their students. And they were quite sometimes conscious of actually being a new generation of teachers. It might be better placed to develop more inclusive teaching than their predecessors in some respects. So there's this theme of aligning school placements with teacher education, and this issue of the variation in the quality of placements that are available to offer learning opportunities for inclusive teaching, and in the ways in which the placement tutors from universities and the cooperating teachers within schools are how well placed they are to actually support inclusive teaching. From the IT providers, there's obviously a constraint in terms of the range of placements that are available. And I think it's worth saying, actually, in the light, again, of our chair's comments initially, it was a finding throughout our different data sources that there was very little preparation for working with parents for the student teachers. So when we spoke to the teacher educators, they reflected similar kinds of views. They also understood the centrality of the school placements and were concerned about the variation. And they felt that it's important not to place the whole responsibility of changing the education system on teacher education. It has a role within a network of agencies, if you like. And that it wasn't necessarily the case that the changes in teacher education had increased the focus on inclusive teaching on the programs because there were other mandatory areas in the curriculum. So they were saying things like, we're having to move beyond the notion it's just about special needs, and that's a challenge for us. And they wanted an opportunity to have their own professional development. And so they were thinking about how staff can collaborate and upskill themselves to be able to do that. Not all teacher educators had experience of inclusive teaching when they were school teachers to the same degree. So I'm going to hand over to Joe to talk about some of the survey data, and then I'll come back and talk about some of the implications.
Okay. So thinking about the staff survey, so some staff aim to embed inclusive teaching across IT programs. Some programs made more space for student teachers to reflect, but interestingly, particularly in the context of the extension of the programs, so coming into this study, there'd been the extension in the length of initial teacher education programs, and our expectation had been, well, if you're going to have this extension in the length, doesn't that mean you're going to have more time for inclusive input on inclusive teaching? But in fact, a number of respondents on the staff survey suggested that actually, well, they'd had less time and that perhaps there had been other priority areas that had been given focus in terms of what providers felt that they were expected to be doing. So that was quite a surprising finding for us, because if we look internationally, there's very much a sense of saying, well, we need to look at extending program length. And if we make programs longer, and I think particularly around thinking around inclusive education, if we make programs longer, that will allow us to do all the preparation work that we need to do with students, with beginning teachers. So that was quite an interesting finding, so it's perhaps not such a clear correlation. And again, the finding that Peter indicated, that teacher educators themselves may need more professional development when it comes to thinking around making sure that the students they're working with are prepared to be inclusive teachers. So just looking here at a slide representing that data, so you can see that in our survey, the respondents thought, well, this area is really relevant for my students. But when you look at whether it was covered in depth, there's much less agreement. And similarly, in terms of how confident they were in covering this area. And we thought that was quite an interesting finding. So there's clearly that commitment to feeling that this is an important area, but doubts about whether there's the time allocated within the curriculum schedule to be able to deliver it, and about their confidence in being able to deliver it themselves. So I think there's potentially an important finding there in terms of looking at professional development for teacher educators. And I think that's something that we felt both from the formal work that we did, but also from the informal contacts. We had many informal contacts with the teacher educators across Ireland, that's something that they were, as a body, were open to and indeed wanted. So coming on to the student survey, so the survey of initial teacher education students. So 48% had prior experience of working with children with special educational needs, and 47% had personal experience of a friend or relative with SEN or disability. And again, going back to the chair's comments, in the international literature, there's quite a bit of emphasis of saying, well, actually, your own experience in terms of your personal relationships, your own experience of special educational needs and disability can be quite important in terms of your own attitudes towards inclusion. So we thought that was interesting to see in the survey. And in terms of their actual experience when they were on school placement, around 60% have responded that they had opportunities to teach students with special educational needs, and over 70% taught students from diverse cultural and ethnic backgrounds. So most students expressed positive attitudes towards inclusive teaching, and 97% agreed that inclusive education is about equality for all, not just special educational needs. Now, when you look internationally at all these studies, there's always that tension between saying, well, are we talking about inclusion? Are we talking about special educational needs? And very much in the project, we were aiming to look at a broad definition of inclusion, but within that, thinking about special educational needs as well. So we saw, again, that there was certainly this attitude from the student teachers was about saying, well, inclusive education is about thinking about all children, not about special educational needs. And also, interesting again, in terms of the current policy developments from the NTSC, 94% agreed that most children with SEN can be included in mainstream. Though, of course, that most is potentially open to interpretation. What do they mean by most? And experience of diversity on school experience was linked with positive attitudes. So we asked, on the survey, we asked students what their level of experience was with working with children with special educational needs, children from culturally diverse backgrounds, children with English as an additional language. And on most of that measure, there was a positive correlation with their attitude towards inclusion. So the more experience they'd had working with diversity in the classroom, the more likely they were to have a positive attitude towards inclusion. So thinking about what the survey results might suggest, so from that last point, ensuring that students on school placement have experiences with a wide range of students. And that's something that's not always easy for initial teacher education providers to achieve, but it's something that is possible. Better support for school placement, more input on practical strategies. So again, the survey results also indicated that students felt that the key thing that they wanted more of was practical strategies around inclusion and more input on subject-specific strategies for inclusive teaching. Now, that does match the international literature and indeed international experience, is that when you ask student teachers in any area, what is it that you wanted more of? They say, well, we wanted less of all this theory and, these ideas about what all these great researchers and theoreticians like John Dewey, whoever it is, said, and we want more about what is it that you should do when you're in the classroom. And in teacher education, there's a tension between that, because actually, as teacher educators, what people want to do is to give students a theoretical bag, and we don't want to give them just a list of tips for teachers. Because if you do that, coming back to that other issue around reflection, how will you develop professionals who are able to reflect on their practice and improve it? But at the same time, when we think about inclusive education and inclusive pedagogy, there's this open question: what does it mean to develop skills around inclusive pedagogy? And maybe that is about saying, well, actually, if we can develop skills around problem solving, about being able to reflect on the particular needs of each child, and to think about what it is that we can do to help them achieve in the classroom, that maybe that's where this issue of practical strategies, of skills, fits in. And again, that links through to what can we do in terms of supporting teacher educators to allow student teachers to develop those skills. Okay, so this slide here, in a way, one of the most interesting findings from the survey data is showing the change in attitude and knowledge from the end of the initial teacher education year to the end of the NQT year. And there's two slides here. So this one is showing about self-efficacy, so their overall confidence in being able to engage in inclusive teaching, and their attitude about inclusion. And you'll see with both of them, there's this very big drop from the IT year through to the NQT year. And I won't talk too much about the scale on the side, but it's showing the standardized score. So it gives you an actual view of the effect size, which is a way of comparing the impact across different studies. And it's got you'll see for both of these, there's quite a significant drop. And in terms of, we might expect to see in studies with effect sizes, we might say that maybe 0.2, 0.5 is a significant effect size. Well, we've actually got quite big drops here, quite a big effect size. So it's showing that there is this real drop between the initial teacher education year and the NQT year in terms of confidence, attitude, and their understanding of what knowledge they've got around inclusion. So to some extent, again, that kind of matches what you might expect, and with an international literature, there's a lot in international literature and policy about saying, well, when student teachers first go into the classroom in their newly qualified teacher year, it's such a big change. They're responsible for the classroom now. They've got to take on. No longer have they got their mentor sitting there telling them what to do. No longer have they got their university tutor helping them. They're suddenly responsible for everything by themselves. All the complexity of the classroom is on their shoulders. And perhaps not surprising, we think, well, actually, that's going to mean that there's a drop in their confidence, and it's referred to as praxis or reality shock in the literature. However, there's actually fairly little empirical data around this. So there's little studies which have actually looked about how student perceptions change, and very little which have focused particularly on inclusion. And the drop that we see here is actually much more significant when we do look at the limited studies which have looked at general drop, so the general drop in confidence, not specifically around inclusion. We actually see that this is a more significant drop than what we see when we look at the general drops in general attitude and self-efficacy and confidence in other studies. So this might suggest that actually, when we think about inclusion, the drop in confidence and attitudes is actually more significant, particularly around inclusion. And that might suggest, again, that what we need to do is really think about how we address that. And Peter's going to come back to talk about some of the other data which we had, which addresses, well, what might we think are the ways in which we could address that change from the IT year into the NQT year. So I'll hand back to Peter.
Okay, so just summing up really the findings from the student teachers that, there wasn't a problem about attitudes to inclusion amongst student teachers. They were positive about it. And they brought with them all sorts of experience that actually could be used as a resource. They had personal experience and prior experience of disability and so on. They wanted a stronger focus on the skill side, and they wanted a closer alignment between the placement and the college-based aspects of their programs. And they were very aware of how different placements offered different experiences in terms of the way they would be supported in different schools. In terms of their experiences when they got jobs as newly qualified teachers, really, I think their capacity to enact their learning on inclusive teaching was really influenced predominantly by the actual context of the school in which they found themselves. Most of them did get jobs as teachers in Ireland, nearly 3/4, usually as temporary roles. None of these NQTs in our sample had jobs in special schools, but over 20% had roles in the DESH schools. And so there quite a range of contexts, and that was really the overwhelmingly influential factor. So they came in very often with some kind of commitment to inclusive teaching, but actually they were relying first and foremost on working with their colleagues, on collaborating with more experienced teachers. And so there's a contradiction in any innovation in teacher education in the sense that, and inclusion comes under that, in the sense that really the role of a student teacher is much more about compliance with the culture of a school, rather than introducing new practices. And they're having to rely on the existing practices of more experienced colleagues in order to build their competence and confidence. And so, and likewise, in terms of preparation for working with special needs assistants, often they didn't feel quite as well prepared for that as they might have wished. We found that about half of the first-year NQTs had part of their time allocated to a resource class or a special class or some kind of specialist provision like that. And most of them, about 70%, had reported some significant or very significant experience of teaching children with special educational needs. So sometimes that worked out very well for them. And I know that NCSE has issued guidance on staff qualifications in special schools. And so that's interesting that NQTs are often placed in resource classes of various categories, particularly in the post-primary sector. Some of them felt that they weren't prepared for those roles and that they weren't well supported. Others found that they were working collaboratively and it was an interesting way of actually being introduced to a school. And some of them found it a positive experience. In general, in their second year of teaching, they found themselves shifting their focus as they developed their confidence from themselves as a teacher to actually the children as learners. And in their interviews, you can see actually a strengthening commitment to inclusive teaching. There is the first year sort of dip, the kind of reality shock, and then as they actually gaining confidence, working with children with a range of needs, you can see how they're talking about strengthening their commitment and developing their confidence in their roles. The kind of CPD experiences they had were really quite variable. There was quite a number were in Drickid schools, about 20% or so. Many of those who attended the induction program the National Induction Programme had quite variable experiences. Some of them felt that the programmes hadn't been updated to reflect their additional extended programmes. So where ITE programmes had been extended and had additional content on inclusion, they felt there was some repetition or overlap in the induction programmes that they attended. They had to kind of navigate some of the constraints around school policies on withdrawal of students and curriculum constraints and time for collaborative planning and so on. And some of them felt that they had been, in a sense, encouraged to develop a notion of themselves as some kind of agent of change. Can we change the education system through a new generation of inclusive teachers? And in a sense, what we found from our data was really that is dependent on the context, once again, in which they find themselves. So many of these new teachers were well placed to contribute to developing new practices, more inclusive teaching, but in a collaborative context. So where a school leader was actually identifying that as a priority, they were able to contribute. They weren't able to act on their own as newly qualified teachers. But generally, school principals did see them as well prepared, relatively well prepared for developing inclusive teaching. Teacher educators, likewise, they recognised the importance of this area. They didn't always feel that well equipped themselves, and they felt they needed greater opportunities for collaboration. Not necessarily another toolkit, but time to actually collaborate amongst themselves, crucially between subject experts and inclusive education specialists. So I think the overall lesson around in teacher education that we felt our data pointed to is the need to embed what we call inclusive pedagogy across the ITE curriculum. So moving further away from having special needs as separate units or modules of a course to really embedding it across the piece. And so and creating these opportunities for subject and inclusive education experts to collaborate with consistent approaches across a whole programme, so there's much less variation. Clearly, teacher educators identified a need for professional learning opportunities for themselves. As I said, primarily time to collaborate with colleagues. And there's a need to find ways of achieving greater involvement of placement tutors and cooperating tutors to bring them on board as part of this discussion. So the inclusive teaching element of school placements is planned more explicitly. And that it's not just about individual differentiation, but looking at whole class approaches to more inclusive teaching as well. So a specific focus on developing the skills for inclusive teaching and addressing this perception of a disconnect between the programs in the college and the skills in schools. So a closer alignment, a partnership, much more in-depth where possible between schools leaders and teacher educators. So clearly the inclusive teaching needs to be assessed. What gets done is what's assessed, in a sense. It is assessed now, but I think a clearer and stronger focus on assessing inclusive teaching would strengthen that. And actually more planning of the experiences for engaging in inclusive practices that student teachers are expected to participate in. Providing opportunities for collaborative critical reflection. So they're going into schools, trying something out, coming back and reflecting on it, consulting with both subject experts and inclusive education experts, and having particular inquiry process to reflect on that. So that's the kind of process that goes beyond the tips for teachers that prepares new teachers to actually develop more inclusive teaching within their own particular context. So for ITE providers, it's about creating these spaces for collaboration and embedding inclusive pedagogy and aligning the school placements with the college-based aspects more systematically where possible within the constraints of school partnerships. And crucially, planned experiences of engaging in inclusive teaching for student teachers linked to focused reflective inquiry processes and opportunities for collaborative critical reflection with subject experts and inclusive education experts, I think is really where our data is pointing. Again, it's not just an issue for teacher education alone. We're talking about teacher education within the context of the school system and all the constraints around that. So there's a case for strengthening the guidance to teacher education providers on school placement, to be more explicit about the range of activities in relation to inclusive teaching that student teachers might engage with, ensuring that these are assessed, and that there's more explicit guidance on the reflection workshops, and that inclusive teaching is identified more explicitly within the induction program, within DRIHID and so on. So that the guidance can align across various education actors and agencies to promote movement around inclusive teaching on a broad front, if you like, including the COSAN, the induction process, and critically the involvement of school principals, really. And one suggestion we had from some school principals was that a commitment to engaging with teacher education, particularly in relation to inclusive teaching, should be seen as part of the professional commitment for any school principal. And clearly school principals are a key partner for teacher educators. So in summary, really, we feel that it's a very exciting time. There's a lot of movement happening, that there is a new generation of teachers who are very positively disposed to developing more inclusive teaching, but they're working within a number of constraints, and it's important not to paint too rosy a picture and to actually engage with all stakeholders and involve them. And as far as teacher education itself is concerned, it's about a wholesale review of programs and actually embedding inclusive pedagogy, thinking about inclusive teaching across the whole program, so that it's not just something for the special needs experts, something for a separate course or a separate module. It's something for all teachers, and therefore it's something for all teacher educators, and it's something for our whole program to do consistently. And that requires something that's difficult to achieve, which is creating space and time for collaborative working between, as I say, people who are experts in particular subjects and those with more expertise in inclusive education, for example. And creating these planned opportunities as a way of linking school and college-based experiences, planned experiences for engaging in inclusive practice with reflective workshops, and moving towards a closer alignment of ITE programs, the school experience, the cooperating teachers, and so on. So I think our research is due for publication shortly, and I think hopefully it will contribute to the discussion that you're having about how far and in what ways the system can move towards more inclusive approaches here. And I'd like to thank you for your time. Thank you.